What other medical conditions or health conditions is having high insulin connected to, and why?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the list is long. And that's why, I sort of use a whole portion of an entire book to devote to it. But just to highlight
Right.
maybe some of the more relevant ones, we could go sort of top to bottom, where Alzheimer's disease is very commonly referred to nowadays accurately as insulin resistance of the brain. In Alzheimer's disease, we know that there is compromised glucose use in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the memory and learning center of the brain. And the hippocampus, like most of the structures of the brain, uses two fuels. It meets all of its very high metabolic rate demands from glucose and ketones. And everyone's heard of ketones because everyone's heard of the keto diet. Probably very
Mhm.
misunderstood, but nevertheless, a ketone is a molecule that circulates in the blood when we're burning a lot of fat. Essentially, when insulin is low, it in fact directly comes from fat. When we start cutting up fat molecules to burn them, some of those turn into ketones. So, regardless, those are the two fuels of the brain, glucose and ketones. Well, glucose needs some insulin to work in order to get into the hippocampus to fuel it, to give it its energy. Well, the hippocampus can become insulin resistant, like so many other parts of the body. And now it has a demand for this much energy, but because it's insulin resistant, it can only get this much from glucose. But most people, because they have chronically elevated insulin, have essentially no ketones in their blood. Because you would say, well, if the hippocampus or the brain can't get all of this energy from glucose use is down here, well, then let's just have ketones fill in the rest. Well, easier said than done. Again, most people don't have enough ketones to fill that gap because their insulin is elevated all the time because they're eating starchy, sugary foods all the time. But it works. The limited evidence, the pilot evidence we have, shows that if you can fill that energetic gap to allow the brain to meet its full metabolic demand, then you do improve cognition. Now, I'm not saying you cure the Alzheimer's. No, that's irreversible. But you do improve it. There are tests to show that the people who do this, they think better, they speak better, and they can perform daily actions better, like getting dressed, for example. So Alzheimer's disease is one of the more sobering examples of what insulin resistance can do, in this case, the brain. Also, to a small degree, Parkinson's disease appears to have some relevance or some connection to insulin resistance, insofar as insulin alters the production of dopamine from those specific neurons that get destroyed in Parkinson's disease. And then as we start to move down briefly, with heart disease, one of the leading causes of heart disease is hypertension or high chronically elevated blood pressure. And insulin resistance drives blood pressure through several totally distinct mechanisms. And in so doing, is really the primary cause of insulin resistance. And indeed, people with hypertension who improve their insulin resistance find that their blood pressure problems, their hypertension is resolved often within days. It's an exceptionally fast response.
Mhm.
And then one other one is the liver. Fatty liver disease is the most common liver problem. Insulin resistance drives the production and accumulation of fat in the liver that high insulin does, the hyperinsulinemia. And then lastly, perhaps fertility, where in women, I already noted the connection with polycystic ovary syndrome. And even in men, the most common fertility issue is erectile dysfunction. And much of the problem, or at least part of the problem, is that insulin can't work properly. Normally, insulin will act in the blood vessels to create something called nitric oxide. And the nitric oxide will cause something called vasodilation, or in other words, it will open the blood vessels. And as the blood vessels open, a man can experience normal erectile function. However, as the blood vessels become insulin resistant, now insulin cannot induce or cannot cause that vasodilation. The blood vessels stay constricted when they should be opened or dilated, and the man experiences erectile dysfunction.
Yeah, that's a pretty good rundown because I think anyone listening can relate to at least one of the things you talked about. Either they have family members with dementia, like Alzheimer's, or they know someone who had a heart attack, or it runs in their family, or they're worried about having a heart attack, or they know people who have fertility problems, which are very often related as well to having high insulin. So, yeah, so there's a lot going on there.